This is Hannibal back here from the Hannibal TV.com with my third draft book entry. Before I get into the third, which is going to be about my amateur wrestling and grappling, I'm just going to jump back into the second, which was about my childhood, because again, I'm doing this as a draft book and I'm doing these live, so there's certain things I forgot. I forgot to mention that both of my grandparents were in World War II. On my mother's side, my grandfather was in the Air Force. My father's side, my grandfather was in the infantry. He was taken prisoner by the Germans at Dieppe, and he was tortured, went through a lot of horrible things, and had terrible PTSD for the rest of his life. And his father was also in World War I, and as I mentioned, my dad was in the military. My dad even convinced me to join the infantry reserves of Cameron Highlanders of Ottawa, which I was in from 1999 to 2000, which I did not enjoy. It was like school on weekends for me, but much stricter because in the reserves you do weekends, and it was interfering with my amateur wrestling, so I didn't last very long in there. The other thing I wanted to mention is I said we were a national championship rugby team. My high school, there was no high school nationals. We were the city champions. I also mentioned that the brother that I lived with accidentally was also adopted. He was not. He was my parents' kid. He came 3 years after me. As far as my natural mother, she ended up having four other kids that I never really got to know. But yeah, the other thing I was going to mention, where I mentioned that my mother was a caregiver, that went well as far as me putting on wrestling events. Because when I was a kid, I was putting on backyard wrestling events from the time I was about 6 or 7 years old for the kids that she looked after, as well as neighborhood kids. The highest amount of fans that we had for one of these backyard wrestling events, which I have a picture up from one of them, was 80 fans, and at that one, the fans kind of got a bit rowdy, and I ended up taking a guitar to the head, probably getting one of my first concussions, and getting split open, having to go to the hospital. So that would have been. They finally ended around the time I was in grade 8 because my parents said, "Okay, that's enough. These are getting too big." And around that time, I was going into amateur wrestling anyway, so I'll just segue into that. And by the way, the last thing I'll say about my parents, my dad was a very honorable person. He still is to this day, extremely honorable. And my mother is a great caregiver to this day, takes care of a lot of people and does it just because she likes taking care of people. As far as my amateur wrestling career, my first year, I did pretty well as a novice. I was in the 72 kilogram weight class. And then the the next year I did even better. I made it to states, the equivalent of states, the provincials, and I won two and I lost two in the provincials. Then the following year, my sophomore year, that's when I kind of had my growth spurt, both as in size. I shot up to about 6'3" and a half, 6'4", and I had been working out in the gym since I was 13 because I always wanted to be a pro wrestler. And by the time I was like, I guess 15, 16, as a sophomore, the gym started to pay off. So as a sophomore, that was the first year that I also started wrestling club a bit to supplement my high school wrestling. And I ended up getting third at the States. And in Ontario, it's a huge state tournament. There's like 42 people, all city champions in the state tournament. And of course, I'd won the cities. I'd pretty much dominated the cities all year, my sophomore year. My senior year, I didn't even get a single point scored against me at the city level. And I actually started doing club wrestling, and I actually medaled at 3 university invitational tournaments while I was still in high school, and I ended up dominating the provincials equivalent to states, just destroying everybody. And then at the club level, I took the Canadian championships, and then I later defended my Canadian champion. The Canadian championships were in London, Ontario. I defended the Canadian championships in Vancouver, BC, and won, and again made the national team. However, in Canada, I remember the world team trials were in Uzbekistan that year, and Canada was not paying for athletes to go to Uzbekistan, at least not in my category. So I never went. That was, and I ended up going to pro wrestling. But I'll just say a few notes. There was an interesting incident after I won the Canadians. The Canadians, I believe, was a 2-day tournament in 2001 in London, Ontario, where AEW recently did a taping. And Ottawa's never been as strong. Things may have changed now. I don't know. But when I was uh, in high school, neither of the Ottawa universities had wrestling teams. So Ottawa was not the strongest wrestling wrestling city. So the tournament for the Canadians was 2 days. So not many of us were left the second day. I think there was only 3 or 4 of us that had made it to the second day of competition. And I believe I was the only one from Ottawa that won a national championship that year. And I believe I'm the only one from my high school that won a state championship. Before I actually get into the junior national championship tournament, I forgot one detail about when I won the cities. Because I was so dedicated to amateur wrestling, I hadn't even kissed a girl until until the City of Ottawa championships in 2001. I remember there was this girl who had a boyfriend. Her name was Danielle, that was quite gorgeous, that gave me my first kiss in between matches at the bottom of a stairwell at Bell High School in um, in 2001. And I remember someone had ratted out to her boyfriend that I had done that, and he never wanted to fight me over it, but that was the end of it there. But as I said, it ended up being good that my parents were so strict with me, didn't let me date girls, and kept me focused on wrestling because I was very good at wrestling. Another story I will say from high school before I tell that junior national story is my high school let me put on my own put on a tournament at my high school my senior year. I was the only wrestler at my high school the senior year. I think I told you they didn't have a football team. Rugby was big. No one wanted to coach wrestling at my high school, so I went to Crean Wilson High School. I still have banners in the gym there, but I had to walk 10 minutes to the Catholic high school to train at the Catholic high school, and the principal or a representative from my school would come with me to the tournaments. So I would have a supervisor that would allow me to wrestle because, as I said, nobody wanted to coach a wrestling team, but they knew I was probably going to win the provincials and that I had universities interested in me, so they made the exception. Funny thing is, today wrestling is huge at that school. Um, the school that I'm from, Crean Wilson, in Orleans, Ontario, Canada. Now wrestling is one of its main sports. So that's pretty cool. I like to think that I may have helped kick that off by my success. And by the way, I did kind of get an ego. I got quite popular at this time because I was constantly getting newspaper articles on me. And I have to admit, I got quite an ego my senior year in high school, which probably helped my confidence. And as I said too, one of the things about doing university tournaments and wrestling men on weekends and training at the club. I interviewed a guy named Kevin Stemp recently on this channel, who's now an author. He helped me a lot as an amateur wrestler. He was straight out of university wrestling, where he was an NAIA All-American, and he was wrestling me like 4 or 5 nights a week at the club. So I became used to wrestling grown men. So wrestling high school kids, even though I was still in high school, was just a breeze by my senior year. So I definitely would love to thank Kevin Stemp for training with me. But I'll tell a crazy story about that night that I won the nationals. It was Super Bowl night. I remember from 2001. I think it was in March of 2001, and me and the couple of other kids that that qualified for the second day. As I said, there wasn't many of us. I think there was three of us. We went to some pool hall um, after after the tournament, and for some reason they weren't IDing. I looked like I was in at that time it was like 19 in Canada. We weren't drinking anyways. We were just playing pool, and we met some girls there, and they were with their mother. We hung out with them until it was time for the pool hall to close, and then the mother invited us back to her house with these two girls that were both beautiful, by the way. I just had no game back then. But here's the weird thing that happened. We get back. I forget if this wasn't the father, this was like the mother's boyfriend, and they were from, I believe, Kitchener, Ontario, which was about, I don't know, an hour, 2 hours away from London. The boyfriend just lived in London for some reason, then and they were visiting. Anyways, we get back to the apartments, and the girls are like, "We're gonna have to wait outside for a bit. There's an argument going on with the boyfriend and the mother inside, so we can't go in the apartment yet." So suddenly we hear this mother getting beaten on the inside. So I end up kicking down the door of the apartment, beating up the boyfriend, and the mother, I think, was had been drinking. She couldn't she actually did drive us to the apartment, but she shouldn't have been driving. And she was too drunk to drive back to Kitchener. So we're like, "Okay, come on back to our hotel room. You can sleep there, what and sober up a bit before you drive back." Then, as we're walking in the parking lot of this apartment complex, the boyfriend comes back out, and again, this boyfriend is like in his 40s. So again, I end up beating the boyfriend up again, pretty much knocking him out in the parking lot, and we go back to the hotel with with the girls where we just talked to them all night. Again, I had no game. I had no game at all. But yeah, that was memorable because those girls were gorgeous, and that was the first time I ever got in a fight with a grown man. And it was just a weird situation. They ended up leaving in the morning. We didn't tell the coach, who was an ex-police officer, the next day. He was in a different room. We didn't tell the coach. Um, but one of the guys that witnessed it, one of the other two kids that was with me, told his high school coach when they got back to Ottawa. And that coach told the club coach that used to be a cop. And he was so mad that we never woke him up when we got back to the hotel to tell him what had happened. So yeah, that was a interesting thing. As far as, and the other thing I'll remember after the after I defended my Canadian title at the national team trials, which I think was in May of that year in Vancouver, some of the older wrestlers took me out for the first time in Vancouver, and they really knew the city well, and they took me to after hours too. And I remember going to the bathroom at an after hours and seeing someone shooting up heroin openly in a bathroom. And keep in mind, my parents were strict. I had never even, I may have at one point gone to a strip club in Hull, Quebec, where they rarely ID'd. I think one time, but that was not Vancouver at 4 in the morning when I was still 17. Seeing people shooting up in in bathrooms. So I remember the national team trials. I won both of my matches. Right, like there was a tournament to see who was going to wrestle me, and then it was 2 out of 3, and I beat the guy in two. So I remember that they just took me out, and it was wild. Vancouver, for people that don't know, is kind of a wild city, and I remember that just being an eye-opening experience to walk in and seeing someone shooting up at that point because like I was a fairly innocent kid, which I lost my innocence fairly quickly. I ended up stopping wrestling and going into pro wrestling because an opportunity came up with Mat Rats, which I'll get into in the next part. Despite being offered scholarships at both Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, they were the only Canadian school that could offer scholarships at the time because they competed in the NAIA for some reason. They competed in the American League rather than the Canadian League, and the University at Buffalo. I really wanted to go to the University at Buffalo, but my parents wanted me to go to Simon Fraser in Vancouver. In the end, I wish I had just continued on with amateur wrestling because I did not know at the time that WWE was recruiting from amateur wrestling. Brock Lesnar hadn't debuted yet. Sheldon Benjamin hadn't debuted yet. I didn't know they were scouting amateur wrestling. Uh, so after I got into pro wrestling around 2008, I started doing MMA training as well. I won the Ontario's in grappling. I won the Canadian Open in no-gi grappling. A bunch of other tournaments. And at some point, when I started doing really well in grappling, I'll get into my WWE contract later, but basically, there was interest in me fighting MMA, but for the same reason I couldn't get my WWE contract, I couldn't accept the MMA contracts due to a health issue I had at the time. So I ended up going back into amateur wrestling, and I was thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to try and make the London 2012 Olympics. So I did a year of amateur wrestling, training basically as an independent, I would go to the Montreal Wrestling Club where George St. Pierre actually trained at the time, so I would see him there all the time. Very nice guy. I never wrestled him because they were very careful who they put him against, and I was a heavyweight. I'm not saying I could beat him in amateur wrestling, but my size, uh, like, was so big at that time that it was just too risky for me to wrestle him. But I did talk to him at those practices from time to time. I also had a guy named Evan Lavoie who was a former national champion in the NAIA. I believe he also went to Simon Fraser. A very good wrestler. He trained me here in Ottawa. He would spar with me to help get me ready. On the way to the Olympic trials that year, I medaled at 3 or 4 tournaments. And at one of those tournaments, I actually beat a guy at the University of Toronto Open in 2011. I beat a guy named Preston Mikulasik, Mikulasik. I beat him 6-2 at the University of Toronto Open, and he ended up winning the 2012 Canadian University Championship. So the equivalent to NCAA Division One, this guy won, and he won those just a couple months later, and those championships took place in Thunder Bay, Ontario, that year. So I'm just saying that it was pretty cool that after being out of wrestling, I won the junior nationals in 2001. I only came back to amateur wrestling in 2011. I beat the guy that ended up winning the university championships. I also, in that same University of Toronto Open, which was a month before the national team trials, which were in Winnipeg that year, I tore my meniscus in a match at the University of Toronto Open, which is a very detrimental injury because I couldn't run. I could no longer do cardio. I could only like do light training for that month leading into the nationals, and I ended up getting second. I was runner up. I got a silver medal at the national team trials in Greco-Roman wrestling. So I know so technically I was an alternate for London. They never ended up needing me. I ended up getting surgery on that torn meniscus. I will get into my Hep C battle after, but I ended up going through all this terrible Hep C treatments. And I did wrestle. I didn't wrestle again after the national team trials, except for one more time in 2014 after I was cured for Hep C. I did the nationals in Edmonton just for fun. I just wanted to say I could still wrestle um, after going through that hellish treatment, and I ended up getting a bronze in Greco-Roman at the Greco-Roman Nationals in Edmonton, 2014. And I had been training with Doug Yeats, whose daughter Dory Yeats is uh, is an Olympian, and he was a five-time Olympian. And leading into those 2014 nationals, I trained at TriStar MMA, where Doug had a little wrestling program, and I would see Rory McDonald, their former UFC fighter, all the time, and I did get the chance to grapple with him a bit, as well as other UFC fighters that were training at TriStar at that time, and that was a true honor. I never had. Sometimes I would do the grappling classes after amateur wrestling in those days, and those were the best workouts I ever had. Like it's a 2-hour drive to Montreal, and I remember the high I would have driving back from Montreal after like sparring and grappling with those UFC fighters. just because like it took me to my physical limit. I'd never had better workouts than that, doing like the whole amateur wrestling class, then when I would do the grappling after. It just like completely took me to my limit. And it was such an honor to sometimes get to grapple with those UFC fighters. It was a blast, but the point is, amateur wrestling doesn't pay anything. And at this point, I was working 3 jobs. I was bouncing. I was working my City of Ottawa job as a personal trainer and fitness attendant, and I was also working in group homes with very violent people with developmental disabilities, which I could write a whole book on the stories of dealing with those, but I don't think I'm going to get into that in this book. But you get attacked a lot working in those group homes. But I still always like those jobs for the most part. Don't miss them. But basically, I stopped amateur wrestling because there was no money in it. And by this point, I was cleared of Hep C. So I thought I would go back into pro wrestling. So that is the amateur wrestling section of the book. I'll say a couple comments. What are my thoughts on bunkhouse brawls? I'm good at them. Mike S says one of the stories are crazy. Sean, like the guys from ECW. Mike, very good. Not sure what you're referring to, but yeah, it was a lot of the stairwell part. Yeah, that girl, by the way, never knew that that was my first kiss because I remember her telling me when she called me after to tell me her boyfriend was mad. And again, he called me too. And I'm like, well, I go to this high school. You can come to my high school anytime after school if you had a problem with that. But she ended up she went to that high school that I was training at. So she didn't actually go to my high school. So I never saw her again after that. But I remember her telling me that the kiss didn't feel like she was extremely hot, that the kiss didn't feel right. But little did she know that was actually my first ever kiss. I was too embarrassed to tell her that. But it was a nice memory. And the funny thing is too, I actually went to prom that year, my senior year of high school, with another guy's girlfriend too. I don't know if I just liked I remember when I oh yeah, one of my most fun um tournaments that I won was I forget, it was just outside of Syracuse. I think it was called the Mohawk Valley tournament. I did a an American high school tournament that I won, and I fought the guy that came second in New York State that year. And I just remember after that match, which I won, we both like lie we were both like lying on our backs on the mat. We had taken ourselves to the limit, but I was so proud that I won that American tournament. But I remember they were selling shirts there that said, "Hold my medals while I kiss your girlfriend." So maybe that was in the back of my head. Um, yeah, Mike knows it, Mohawk Valley. I remember that because my dad from the military, there was like some affiliation with some American regiment near Mohawk Valley. So we stayed at a friend of his from New York. I think they lived in Auburn, New York, their house. And he was an amateur wrestling fan. And I just remember that that Fred was so proud that I went in there and won. And he passed away recently. Um, but he was so proud that I went in there and won that tournament. So that was one of my most satisfying tournaments I ever won, the Mohawk Valley 2001 tournament. Anyways, guys, that's all I'm going to say about amateur wrestling. It was good to me. It was a lot of fun. I never reached my full potential in amateur wrestling. I one thing I forgot to tell you when I did the Olympic trials and did those university tournaments in 2011, I was unrepresented. I would just grab anyone to coach me. I didn't even have a coach. I was wrestling as an independent. So consider that. Imagine if I had an actual coach and was part of a team. And that was after being out of amateur wrestling for 10 years. But I always loved it. It's a great sport. And I'll continue giving back to it, for the rest of my life.